Hello and welcome to this video on one of the bigger changes in the US education system in the last few years, if not into recent decades, and why Common Core has failed. In essence, the Common Core was the education policy in the USA that focused heavily on just two areas of education, maths and English language arts. The latter being a fancy way of saying, if you are spoken to, can you understand what is being said? Can you read something and understand what has been written down? Can you communicate back by speaking, and can you write in a coherent manner? In theory, having these two areas of education soundly established would have given students the ability to grow in other areas of education where these skills were needed, and in most cases absolutely essential. For example, applying math and science, or English arts in writing reports, describing work, or analysing something that's literal art. The problem is there is a gaping chasm between theory and practice when it comes to Common Core. Oh, and the absolutely insane focus on standardized testing. In short and simple terms, as per research into this, quote, we find a significant negative effect of the CCSS on student achievement in non-targeted subjects, end quote. CCSS being Common Core. And that quote is rather damning, so let's look at what happened and particularly how it failed. More so since we now have more than 10 years of data to not only drive the future direction of this, but direct us as to the efficacy and flaws of Common Core education. And quote, contrary to our expectation, the data revealed that the Common Core standards produced significant negative effects on the fourth graders' reading achievement during the 7 years after adoption of the new standards, end quote. The first issue we have with this, and one of the reasons why Common Core failed, is simple enough. Common Core focused so heavily on standardized tests that it often led to the neglect of actual education. These tests were part of the policies of No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. Essentially, America began to panic, thinking our students are getting worse and worse in terms of education attainment, and compared to other countries like India and China, we're not that good anymore. We need to do something. This led to the Common Core being used, but when you set it up, at least the government-wise, the entire metric by which they could establish if it was working was testing, standardized testing. And all these tests were done under the No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top policies. Schools were then judged on the performance of students in this standardized testing, and if, and this is a big if, students are either at risk of not doing well, or if students didn't do well, the schools could be heavily penalized, whether it's the qualifications for grants, actually getting funding, the teacher evaluations, and so on. So, this was a very high risk, relatively low reward scenario. If schools didn't perform well, they were penalized. If they performed well, nothing happened. So, what do you do if, no matter what you do, you're either going to be damned or you're just going to see no change? You avoid anything and everything that could possibly harm you, and in this case, it was students failing standardized tests. If there was a remote risk of being in the low-scoring category on these tests, students were pulled out of subjects that were unrelated to math or English language arts and put into, essentially, extra lessons. And this would then allow them to get pushed up to the passing line, or if not just over. However, doing so came at a cost, because there's only so many hours of class time in a day, only so many days and weeks of class teaching in a year, and teachers or administrators had to find time for these supplementary classes. The only option? Take students out of other classes that weren't math or English language arts and put them into supplementary lessons at the same time. The problem with this is very simple. English language arts and math in the case of Common Core relied heavily on peripheral, tangential, or extraneous knowledge not contained within those two subjects. That meant that yes, you could theoretically teach students better in relation to those Common Core classes, but you were depriving them of the necessary education in the other areas that Common Core then relied on. This is sounding like a catch-22, right? Yeah. Essentially, the administrators set up a system wherein you needed to have certain knowledge, but you were deprived of that knowledge, and therefore you were deprived of those classes, which meant you would then not perform well on the test, which meant you'd then be deprived of those classes, and it would just keep going. This was, of course, entirely and utterly a bureaucratic decision. Admittedly bureaucratic in terms of, yes, the executive of America at the time, that being Obama, President Obama, was involved, but then again, so were the prior president, that being Bush, and essentially a whole bunch of different administrators in the government. What they wanted was a standard that would allow for the policy to be nationwide, a policy that would be implemented and say, this is how America will achieve greatness again. Yeah. That is basically how they ended up making this weird, almost orcish-looking abomination of a system in which you have academic standards and testing, you have high risk attached to it, and you don't really have a lot of real-world, on-the-ground, directly interfacing with students, input that has meaning. It meant that everything came from the very top with the direction of, here's what you need to do, here's how we expect you to achieve it, and we're not going to give you the latitude and necessary flexibility to be able to do anything in the classroom to modify it to what you need. This being particularly important when you may have a class of, say, 30 students where you have 10 high performers, 10 medium, and 10 low. High-performing students may not require the extra support. The 10 medium-performing students may be able to work with the Common Core system, but you'll need to provide them with the necessary education? Yes, which is quite time-consuming. But the low-performing students needed even more time that they weren't able to get because you already have 20 other students who may or may not be tying up the teacher at that time. And so, this brings us to what inspired this whole shit show to start with. And in some respects we can blame two things. One is America's inferiority complex about educational attainment and the fact that places like China and India are doing better than them, but the other is, to an extent, internal jealousy, envy, something like that anyway, towards Massachusetts. Massachusetts had an interesting, let's say, change over time. They've consistently and reasonably reliably demonstrated higher academic performance, and so the government's looked at them and gone, that's a model state, let's take whatever they've done, regardless of how it's been implemented, and then make it true across the entirety of America, in very simplified terms. And so you have a problem. Massachusetts may be very different to, say, California, or Texas, or Alaska, and because of that, the ability to apply whatever Massachusetts is doing doesn't really hold, especially if you can't modify it on the ground at an individual school or classroom level to meet the needs of those students. What made Massachusetts such a glowing example of things that need to be followed was that they had year on year shown improvement. Most other states were showing the opposite, that is, year on year things were getting worse. In terms of the actual outcome of applying this, well, if we ignore COVID for now, you'll find that the vast majority of states did not perform better. In fact, 70% performed worse than they were before Common Core came in. 30% of states performed better. But that comes with a massive catch on both sides. The states that performed the worst before Common Core are the ones that showed the greatest improvement after it came into effect. And inversely, those that were showing the greatest gains before Common Core were the ones that made the most losses once it came into effect. If we look at how it's actually been put into effect and how Common Core was used, we can split it between the English language arts and the maths side. In terms of the English language arts, there's a big issue to do with comprehension. We've mentioned this already in passing, but essentially, the English language arts element relied heavily on the ability to understand information that wasn't directly within the course itself or within the subject matter. You needed a more general knowledge base, a greater vocabulary, things that just aren't necessarily included in English language arts. And so, when those subjects are essentially thrown away in favor of more time studying the English language arts unit, you actually find that students lose capacity. The ability to comprehend what they're looking at, whether it's a written statement, whether it's, say, a book section, whether they're being given instructions, and so on. They may not be able to understand these as well because they simply don't have the necessary diversity of information and knowledge base to do so. And of course, things do get worse because unlike, say, math, where you have a fairly specific set of standards and things that need to be included, for example, the ability to do basic addition or subtraction, English language is rather more ephemeral. That is, it's nowhere near as structured and clear-cut. Because of that, and particularly when we talk about things like, let's say, reading a section of a book, which shouldn't be the goal, it should be the whole book, but ignoring that for now, you may not be able to necessarily understand enough about not only what you have read, but how that would translate going forwards, or be able to make a prediction based on it, because you don't have enough knowledge about either the world itself in which you're trying to read or predict on, or, in other instances, simply because the main idea is so completely foreign and different. Math was a little bit different, and it's only different in terms of the negative impacts are better quantified, let's say. For example, in 5th grade, Common Core content was at least a year behind, and by 7th grade, it's at least 2 years behind where students should be. That's a really big loss. There is one other catch to this though, and that is in terms of math. In general terms, the higher scoring students appeared to see a general overall improvement in their scores. Now, there is some argument to be made here as to whether or not this is socioeconomics, whether it's something to do with just simply having parents who are more affluent, issues around how Common Core has been implemented, and so on, but no matter how you look at it, students who before Common Core seem to score higher, continue to score higher in Common Core after a slight lag period. That is, there was an initial drop-off due to the implementation and initial period in which Common Core was used, and then, since then, scores have progressively increased. On the other hand, if you're below the 90th percentile, you basically are shit out of luck. Now, between roughly the 90th and 75th percentile, you have less impact, but once you get below that, you start seeing notable drops again, and basically every quartile sees that effect amplified significantly. The worst being the 25th and then 10th percentiles. So it's essentially amplified issues around socioeconomics. If you were doing well beforehand, partly due to income and similar, you continue to do well afterwards, eventually, and if you were doing poorly beforehand, well, you're doing a lot worse now. What we have is essentially the American government at a federal level trying to recreate what was relatively successful on a much smaller scale, that being what happened in Massachusetts. And there's a big problem there because there is a lot of difference in states. We've already mentioned if you were to try and compare just 4, spread across most of America. But even if you weren't just to compare those 4 and try and compare those around Massachusetts itself, you would find that there are still massive differences that make it nearly impossible to replicate what happened in terms of education in Massachusetts. The only way the Common Core could really have worked, and arguably what it has done, is to try and push mediocrity, that is, to try and achieve the lowest possible standard that could theoretically be accepted on a national level. And this is where things went very badly, because that meant that you had to achieve that minimum level in every school, and every school therefore was only teaching to that minimum level because that's what they had to achieve. If they couldn't make that, they would essentially be penalized or punished. And as a result, teachers focused on the tests, not on the education. If the point had been to be able to focus on the education and then measure that performance in tests, things would have gone so much more better. But instead, it was done ass backwards, or the cart before the horse, if you will. Focusing only on the outcome, that is the number that should have told you how well the teaching was being done, instead, it was the testing that became what was being taught, which doesn't work. To use a very rough example, let's say that the test requires you to know that a tomato is a fruit, and instead of knowing, okay, tomato is a fruit, cool, move on, they keep going on about this point. And when you go to get a test, you get a test that says, which of these things is a fruit? And there's a picture of a banana, an apple, a tomato, and a potato. But that doesn't help you in the real world, because if you're going to go make a fruit salad, you're probably not going to put a potato in it anyway, nor a tomato. Because of that, there's a huge missing part of the education that was necessary. And of course, not being able to apply that is where we get to the issue here. In slightly more simple terms, Common Core tried to solve a jigsaw puzzle by assuming you had all the other puzzle pieces, and that what they would do would just fill in that one missing piece. In reality, schools focused on only the missing piece, and therefore the students had no way of knowing where their specific knowledge went in order to use it. The problem was no one was taught that general knowledge, and therefore they had no way of contextualizing what it is that they were learning, mostly because it was not tested by Common Core standard testing. At best, Common Core has had a neutral effect, but there has been very solid evidence that it either has had no performance improvement, which, given the cost and resources going into it, is ridiculous, or there's been a net negative effect that's been observed. This is why federally Common Core has almost completely been abandoned. Sadly, despite this, Common Core as a standard does not look like it will go away, but it will likely be rebranded and renamed without substantive changes to the actual content and core issues of Common Core, which is something of an irony. The people who are making this policy have not been able to learn how to make the policy work, or the fact that it has failed. Thank you for watching this video. Please do like, share, and subscribe, and if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, post them in the section below.